Almost there. Okay. And we've got no sound.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, we're live.
All righty. Welcome all to the 12th day of June, 5 p.m. plus. Welcome to This and That. We're gonna continue on. We'll hopefully get to the end of the summary of Volume 1, which is pretty hard to do considering, nearly 1,000 pages. Fortunately, Simon Clarke's summary is only 40 pages and useful, I hope. We did spend far too much time yesterday on Chapter 1. Chapter 2, probably no less tedious, but no, we got to Chapter 6, and we're going to start with Chapter 7. So I'll go through this probably a little faster. The point, of course, is to sort of disentangle what counts as labor. And as we've seen in a variety of other summaries, the idea of knowledge production as being part of this basic set of ideas. Some people don't want to think about it and don't want to integrate it, but I would hope that it's clear that the move to a humanist Marxism is in one sense trying to make the production of knowledge in this context as labor, as a kind of labor, cognitive labor, clear to folks that, these are people not just moving their, it's not time and motion studies. It is people actually thinking people at the machines, if nothing else. And I think Elon Musk found that out when he tried to fully automate the Tesla factory. So these are continuing issues and ones that I think are still relevant to this day to sort of disentangle all of the things that talking about means of production. People can be means of production. They can be Soylent Green too, but all sorts of matters. So the chapter looks at production from 2 points of view: the production of use values without regard to the social relations within which that production takes place, and the production of value. Remember, value is this idea, an abstract idea, an idea that gets us at this idea of abstract labor that, somebody has to think it, right? If it's abstract, it doesn't just exist in the ether. Rather, people have to think it. People have to communicate it. The first part of the chapter thus looks at those aspects of the labor process common to all societies. Production is the action of labor by means of instruments of labor to produce a product. At the end of the first section, Marx notes that in the first instance, the nature of the labor process is not changed by the fact that it is a capitalist labor process. Marx considers the development of the specifically capitalist form of the labor process in chapters 13 to 15. Remember, this is Simon Clarke's summary of these things, and stuff gets left out. In the first instance, the main differences are, number one, that the labor process is directed by the capitalist, and number two, the capitalist appropriates the product. And so already it seems a little insidious and maybe unfair. But the idea, and that we've seen it advanced in the 20th and 21st century, is this direction issue. And yes, it could be a dictatorship in that sense. What kind of dictatorship is always problematic. But the question is that industrial organization in the 20th century actually goes through these same kinds of processes. The second section looks at the specifically capitalist aspects of the labor process. as the labor process as the production of value and of surplus value. He stresses that the aim of the capitalist is not the production of use values in themselves, but the production of use values as the bearers of exchange value. Thus, the capitalist labor process is a combination of the production of use values already discussed and the production of value and surplus value. As a process of production of value, the labor process is simply a process in which abstract labor is expended, is incorporated in the product. Now, this is where the congealed thing comes in, sort of, I guess. Thus, the product serves not as specific use value, but as a definite quantity of labor, definite masses of crystallized labor time. You see, that's that congealment thing again. And crystallizing, gives it short shrift in that sense that it is simply static. The discussion, 6 pages of which is rather long-winded. The main point is to show that the source of surplus value lies in the difference between the value of labor power and the value created in the course of the working day. And if he could have just said that, it would have been fine for those 6 pages. Marx shows that if the worker only works for six hours, then no surplus value is created. He emphasizes the crucial distinction between the value of labor power and the value created by that labor power when it is set to work. It only takes a half a day to produce the worker's means of subsistence, but he can work for a full day. And this is the source of surplus value. In other words, and of course, it's problematic to aggregate, of course. And so that's why it goes into these abstractions and generalizations. That is, the worker's means of subsistence is different for everyone, right? I mean, you could get clones to do this and then they'd be more uniform. But the fact of the matter is, there is subjectivity at work. Thus, the contradiction is resolved. Surplus value is created without violating the laws of commodity exchange. So, in other words, stuff's getting made and it's not problematic. Some people give up their labor sort of unknowingly in that context in terms of surplus value. The distinction between labor process and valorization process is a fundamental one. It is the unity of the two that constitutes the capitalist production process. Remember, we talked about valorization as being a kind of additional value that's being created from perhaps even waste. The production of use value is dominated by the production of surplus value. Now, this question of domination, don't take it too far. Thus, in a capitalist society, it is only insofar as the production process produces surplus value that it will be undertaken by the capitalist. This is intent and motive. The production of use values is conditional on the production of surplus value. You only know, and this is not saying that they're synonyms, but you only know if it's going to turn a profit. Chapter 8. See how far we got? This chapter introduces the important concepts of constant and variable capital. Marx argues that the value of the product is made of the value added by the worker on the one hand, and the value transferred from the means of production to the product. This division corresponds to the division between abstract labor, the expenditure of socially necessary labor time, which by definition in this case is also knowledge, and concrete labor. Excuse me, the production of a specific product by a specific kind of labor. And he spends 4 pages on this in detail. Marx emphasizes that the value of the means of production is determined by the labor required to produce those means of production, thus exists prior to the labor process, while the new value created by labor is created in the labor process itself. The new value added may exceed the value of labor power, i.e., the worker may work for longer than the number of hours socially necessary to produce his or her means of subsistence. So you can see how this works, right? You don't really get a sense of what that difference is. This difference between labor and means of production, distinct roles in the valorization process falling to distinct elements of the labor process, this difference corresponds to the different roles or different parts of capital that is means of production and labor power, are different forms of existence of the original capital. Thus, constant capital is that part of capital which is turned into means of production and does not undergo any quantitative alteration of value in the process of production. While variable capital, that part of capital which is turned into labor power, does undergo an alteration of value in the process of production. Note here that you have this idea that, well, as an individual, something's going to get taken, but you kind of don't know what it is, and it could be different for other people on the assembly line. Nota bene, for Marx, capital is not the simply the means of production. Capital is a sum of money that is value laid out on means of production and labor power. In this sense, labor power is therefore a part of capital, and so shares in the fate of capital, that is, when the firm goes bankrupt. So you can see how labor can be made abstract in that kind of way. At some moment, you got to stop making crap because you're losing money. That is, if you talk about the capitalists. Do not confuse the distinction between constant and variable capital, which refers to different roles in the valorization process. Remember that, please. With what are known as fixed and circulating capital, which refers to the difference between capital tied up for a long time, like machines, and then you get into, amortization and depreciation and all that shit. And that which turns over quickly, then somewhat replaceable or variable, circulating in that sense. That's why it gets misidentified as variable capital, because it is also circulating. And this idea of circulation, of course, we know is this larger question that Marx brings up throughout Volume 2, is this question of circulating capitals. That is, labor power and raw materials turn over quickly. So you have this something that is fixed and something that circulates. That is, you have a machine, you have people operating the machines or feeding the machines raw materials, and so that's constant circulation. It is variable, but it is also circulating. So don't try to, because often these are used interchangeably, and it can be problematic. So you need to think about the production side of this, but also this larger capital idea that is both variable and circulating, but not necessarily identical. Finally, and valorization hopefully makes you separate those two things. Finally, you might wonder why it is that only the using up of labor power creates new value. In the last analysis, it is simply because of the definition of values that Marx uses. Value is simply an expenditure of labor. Now, that's a little reductionist, but you need to get a sense of what that means in terms of presenting this to working people, to organizing the working class, et cetera, et cetera. And it is a little bit more than that, of course, as we've discovered and as I've suggested. But you need to get a sense of who the audience is. The labor embodied in means of production has already been expended, so that their value is given in advance. Labor power has the unique property of creating value anew as it is used up. Now, that's not necessarily true, but in some ways it is the idea of reducing labor to just simply an input. And you need to think of it sort of as more than that, particularly since if you've read the manual, you know how the machine works. And so therefore there's other things at work. Chapter 9, see how fast that was? This chapter introduces the concept of the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation. Although the whole capital advanced appears to increase in the valorization process, it is in fact only the variable part that increases. That's the valorization issue. That's why Romer sort of got in trouble with Orthodox Marxists to suggest that socialism, that you would still get some exploitation in socialist production. The ratio of surplus value to the total capital advance, that is the rate of profit. This is a ratio. Note that Marx does all these things as ratios, which does suggest, had he gotten to calculus, it would have, or through calculus, it would have worked out a little better. Is important, but Marx leaves it aside for now to define the rate of surplus value, which is the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital. Okay, this is this valorization component. That's why valorization falls on that side. This is the same thing as the ratio of surplus labor, the labor time spent beyond that sufficient to replace the value of the worker's labor power, to necessary labor, the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor, as opposed to sufficient labor. The labor time spent replacing the value of labor power, that is, the number of hours socially necessary to produce the means of subsistence. And as we decided, perhaps there's an average, but that doesn't necessarily fall to each person. And people are endowed with different capabilities, right? If you put a kid in charge of the machine, it might not have the same sort of issues. It might be better because the kid decided to read the manual, but whatever. The surplus value simply represents a portion of the worker's labor time. And you can skip pages, at least 12 pages, and there are numerical examples. And then there are, of course, a different way of calculating the relation between necessary and surplus labor. And 33 to 38, 333 to 38 is a polemic against the theory that profit is produced only in the last hour of labor put forward by NASA Senior. The point is there that you don't have to spend time measuring all the labor, just the last bit of labor. And I hope you can see that that's kind of a limited way of looking at it. Ultimately turned over by the problem of turnover. That is Taylorization in the 20th century that applies behavioral techniques to analyze wasted motion and wasted time. Chapter 10. Here, Marx argues that the length of the working day cannot be determined analytically. It is set within the limits of the necessary labor time, the minimum, and the physiological and social maximum that can be sustained. The capitalist demands as much as possible. The worker demands a shorter working day. Thus, between these limits, these perimeters, it is the struggle between capital and labor, the capitalist class, the working class, that determines the length of the working day. This is the selling point, right? This is the talking points you give. This gives the working class agency. In the second section, Marx argues that it is only when production is for exchange value that the boundless thirst for surplus labor arises, because before this, the demand for surplus labor is limited by the needs of the exploiting class. The rest of the chapter looks at the struggle over the length of the working day, and this is still an issue, right? Time clocks, etc. Marx points to the tendency of capital to lengthen the working day as much as possible, far beyond the limits of endurance for the workers, so that the labor force is debilitated. He notes that this happens, although it might seem to be in the interest of the capitalists to limit the exploitation of labor so as not to undermine the strength and numbers of the labor force in the future. But in fact, capital does nothing because of overpopulation. So there's more people. You can always plug in the input, right? Just get another worker, which constantly provides new workers. And because competition between capitalists imposes such practices on every capitalist, if he is to compete, thus it is this class struggle that determines the length of the working day. The bulk of the chapter goes over the legislation that has regulated the working day. And of course, when this is being written, that this was a contentious issue. Until the 19th century, such legislation was imposed by capital to try and lengthen the working day, the top end, although the length established was less than that which became normal in the 19th century. And the 19th century legislation has resulted from the struggle of workers exploiting divisions within the working class and between capitalists and landowners. But even the legislative gains have been eroded by employers. Thus, the workers have had to struggle for enforcement as much as for initial legislation. So, for example, flight attendants are not paid for the time that they spend walking or getting to the airplane. They only get paid once they step over the threshold of the fuselage. The chapter on the working day describes the attempts of capital to increase the amount of surplus labor by extending the working day. This chapter tidies up a few loose ends. Marx establishes that the total mass of surplus value produced is equal to the variable capital advance multiplied by the rate of surplus value. Secondly, he notes that there are limits to the extent which capital can compensate for a reduction in the variable capital advance by employing fewer workers, for example, trying to minimize costs, by an increase in the rate of exploitation by lengthening the working day. So you're sort of trading these things off. And my little flight attendant example is about, can represent that kind of example. It's if you change a few variables. Thirdly, he notes that if the value of labor power and the rate of exploitation are fixed, then the mass of surplus value produced is proportional to the variable capital advance. Then Marx then notes this law clearly contradicts all experience based on immediate appearances, since in practice, capitals receive profit in proportion to the total capital laid out, that is the rate of profit. So it is a sort of misnomer. Clearly, this apparent contradiction will have to be resolved, but not by violent abstraction. That is, asserting that there's no contradiction without a thorough analysis, or by abandoning the regulative law for the appearance, as vulgar economy does. And Marx postpones the task to volume 3, namely because it just takes too much damn work and, essentially need to develop all these other things first, or it's better to do that. To be a capitalist, it is necessary to have a certain minimum quantity of money that can serve as capital, i.e. enough to bring back sufficient surplus value to live on the labor of others. It's the front end, as they say. As capital takes command of production, the capitalist directs the labor of the worker and the capital relation. The relation between capital and labor becomes a coercive one. That is, capital has its own kind of agency in that context, but it is also the structure, the relation between capital and labor. At first, capital does not change the methods of production inherited from the past. You just, it's old-fashioned stuff. This is the way prior practice. The production of surplus value by the extension of the working day was as effective in old-fashioned forms of production as in the newest. 2.0 it sort of works for a while until you shut it off. Finally, when capital takes hold of production, an inversion takes place. When it is the worker directing production who is the subject of the labor process, master of the machine, it is capital that is the subject of the valorization process, so that the machine is the master of the worker. What a twist. This inversion, of course, is fairly obvious. That is, the machine never dies in that particular context, whereas you can wear out. You can just get tired. It just is problematic. And you don't need to watch Fritz Lang's film Metropolis to understand that, or watch Charlie Chaplin's Modern Time. But those are the films you would use to explicate this. So the production of surplus value. I give you several diagrams here to sort of offer up a way of differentiating between, you have these other dichotomies or distinctions that you already have to remember. Constant and variable, fixed and circulating. And if you can keep those all separate in your mind, you should be able to work out the difference between absolute and relative. So the difference between an 8-hour day and a 10-hour day, you could extend the working day by adding 2 hours at the same rate of pay, of course. This is where the issue gets crazy. The length of the working day remaining the same, increasing surplus value by reducing necessary labor time is relative surplus value. So the difference between the two is simply about day length on the one hand. And so you're essentially holding one element constant or whatever, increasing surplus value by reducing the necessary labor time. So you get kind of, additional hours worth of work by reducing necessary labor time. So this is how you sort of talk about this in the shop. You have an 8-hour working day. You have sort of necessary labor time, which on the one hand is, a necessary, but you can develop surplus, and that surplus value comes from capital's share taken out of the labor share, of which is the value. So you see the value of labor power defined by wages, and capital's share, which of course appears huge here, probably a little bit smaller than that on the one hand, but it's there, and surplus value gets taken from that. So in terms of surplus value, the working day provides opportunities by lengthening the working day, where surplus value, that surplus value is taken from a longer working day, and relative surplus value, which is taken from, kind of making refinements that that force you to work harder, or work with greater productivity, also called intensity. Also can be measured by widgets produced, needless to say. So in verbal terms, that's what this is: the production of relative surplus value against necessary labor time in the context of the working day. Now, how does the capitalist do? What does capitalists do with this? It is the extraction of surplus value through the exploitation of labor power. It is meant to, as we were talking about chapters ago, commodities is producing a kind of commodity which are purchased and for consumption. And then you get the kind of complicated issues of price and value, et cetera. Surplus value is realized in the profit. That is, you pay your money and something gets skimmed and or goes back to the merchant and then to the original producer, et cetera, et cetera. So you have all those little parts in there. And the capitalist gets profit, reinvests the profit. But in the case of, for example, stocks, they can go back in and buy more stocks. They can create more stocks and buy more stocks, and hence get a little bit more off the top when the stocks become more profitable. Which is what happens when you get a kind of tax cuts and other kinds of things, right? Chapter 12. This chapter introduces the concept of relative surplus value. Surplus value can be increased not only by lengthening the working day, but equally with the given length of the working day by reducing the length of the period of necessary labor. Although in practice it's often done by paying labor power above its value, Marx is assuming that all commodities exchange at their value for now. So this possibility must be left aside. So, Marx is trying to make the math simple, holding certain things constant. Thus, the necessary labor time can only be reduced by reducing the value of labor power. For example, the amount of labor time required to produce the worker's means of subsistence. So this is a squeeze on your ability to, feed your family. This in turn depends on an increase in the productivity of labor. Thus, the conditions of production of his labor, i.e. the mode of production and the labor process itself, must be revolutionized. Capital can no longer take the mode of production as given. Nota bene, a fall in the value of labor power does not mean a fall in the real wage, but rather a reduction in the time required to produce the means of subsistence. In other words, looks the same, but they're getting more out of you. This leads Marx to distinguish absolute surplus value, which is produced by the lengthening of the working day, from relative surplus value, which arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time. How is relative surplus value produced? It cannot be produced directly by a single capitalist, for it depends on a reduction in the time taken to produce the worker's means of subsistence, and thus involves a large number of capitalists improving their methods of production. Now, this goes to a whole bunch of other issues about knowledge of technical processes, numbers of workers, and you can sort of save some of those problems, as the auto industry did, by having things made in the same factory for different products. That is, for example, a GM, among many others. In fact, it probably did a better job at it than Ford. Makes all the standardized parts for a variety of different brands, so that Buick, Oldsmobile, and Chevy all have the same chassis. In some cases, they do or don't have. They have tried this at times to fill in to put the same engine in, which they didn't do, partially because some people are aware of that, and certain other standardized parts. But I mean, if you use the standard frame, you're using a lot of the same chassis components, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So badge engineering, therefore, is a lot easier to do than actual engineering. Those of you becoming industrial designers. Thus, Relative surplus value is produced by the generalized development of the productivity of labor in those industries that supply the means of subsistence or the means of production of means of subsistence. Hence, improvements in the productivity of labor in industries producing luxury goods do not affect the rate of surplus value. They simply cheapen capitalist consumption goods. Cheapening in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of things that appear to be worth more, but they do the same damn thing. And you can see that if you live in certain areas or if you go to different stores. Improvements in productivity do not benefit the capitalist who introduces them as much as they benefit all capitalists taken together. This is that structural thing. It's the reason why abstraction is important. If the productivity of labor in baking is improved so that bread is cheapened and money wages correspondingly reduced, the gains accrue to all capitalists, not only to the bakers. Since capitalists are no more philanthropic towards their fellow capitalists than they are towards their workers, we have to ask why they introduce these improvements in productivity. The general and necessary tendencies of capital must be distinguished from their forms of appearance. Back to Hegel again, this idea of something essentially is one thing, but it appears as something else. In fact, it is competition that drives each individual capitalist to increase the productivity of labor. If a capitalist can improve methods of production and so produce with less than the current socially necessary labor time, this cost shifting, then he can make extra profits since the price will still correspond to the old methods of production. As other capitalists introduce the new method of production, the price will fall and the extra profits will be eroded. Those capitalists who stick with the old methods of production will find their profits eliminated altogether because they now produce with more than the socially necessary labor time. Thus, every capitalist will seek to improve the productivity of labor to increase his profits or defend his profits from competitive erosion. In the short run, the extra profits produced will accrue to the capitalist who introduced the new technique. But soon, competition will erode this extra profit and the price of the commodity will fall. So, you know, it is this question of learning how to do certain things or introducing a new factor of production. If this commodity enters into the production of workers' means of consumption or enters their consumption directly, the fall in price will reduce the value of labor power and so the necessary labor time, and so the rate of surplus value for all capitalists. If it is a luxury item, the cost of living of capitalists will fall, but there will be no increase in surplus value. It's important to understand that the earning of extra profits by an individual capitalist who introduced an improved method of production is not the same thing as the production of relative surplus value, which involves the capitalist system as a whole. This is a question of sort of emphasis and scale. All of these things are at work at the same time. It's a circulating process. It's something that because it moves around, it is problematic. In particular, the capitalist who produces luxury goods can earn an extra profit, but make no contribution to increasing relative surplus value. And my example here, of course, is that brand engineering. So in the simple case, you have in one production year, you have a car which is called what's it called? It's not a Chevette. Is it a Chevelle? No, whatever the hell it's called. Anyway, they rebadge the damn thing and make it into a Cadillac. Echo. They rebadge it as a Cadillac, but essentially it's still the Chevelle or whatever. And I can go hunt down the version that it is.
I believe that was the Cimarron.
Perhaps. That may be the Cimarron. You know, they just switch the badges on it, give it better interiors, and it's a Cadillac. And I'll have to find the example. I don't. It's been a long time. Thus, the individual capitalist seeks to economize on labor, to reduce the amount of labor needed to make his product. The implication of the constant advance of productivity for the system as a whole, however, is a cheapening of the worker. You can see this applies across an industry. A reduction of the value of labor power, and so, across the industry, an increase in surplus value. Thus, surplus value can be increased not only by extending the working day, but also as capital transforms methods of production by increasing the productivity of labor. With due respect, he does spend a far too much amount of time explaining this stuff. And, you know, I don't think he needed to do that, but I think it's the question of how the notes were written. Chapters 13, 14, and 15. These three chapters deal with the progressive transformation of the mode of production carried out as capital took hold of production. It is the progressive transformation that leads to the steady increase in the productivity of labor, and so the production of relative surplus value. These three chapters, therefore, sketch out the material foundation of the production of relative surplus value, i.e., the development in the social relations of production to which the production of relative surplus value corresponds. Chapter 13 considers cooperation. This is, you know, getting the workers to work together, bringing them under the command of a single capitalist. This is both the logical foundation and the historical starting point of capitalist production. This is different, of course, from the feudal workshop. You do have a group of apprentices and journeymen doing this kind of work, but this is at scale. Initially, capital simply increases the scale of handicraft production. This increase in scale has its effects. Number one, the differences between individual workers are evened out so that labor comes to have, from the start, a socially average character. Number two, the increase in scale produces a revolution in the objective conditions of the labor process, i.e., or for example, e.g., buildings are transformed and economies of scale reduce costs of production even before the labor process itself is affected. Cooperation makes possible advances in productivity, but workers can only cooperate if brought together. Thus, the scale of cooperation depends on the size of capital in the hands of the capitalist, who must combine workers and means of production. This is, you know, a cost problem. Moreover, cooperation makes the subjection of labor to capital no longer something accidental, but makes it into a real condition of production, since it is only capital that can bring the workers together in a capitalist society. Hence HR. Thus, the work of directing, superintending, and adjusting comes one of the functions of capital. But capitalist control is also a function of the exploitation of the labor process, and in both functions, the form of capitalist control is despotic. And if you've had despotic HR people, you'll know what I mean. The increase in productivity that becomes possible with cooperation, because it only appears with the subordination of labor to capital, appears to be the product of capital itself. The productive power of collective labor appears to be a productive power inherent in capital. Capitalist cooperation is only one social form of cooperation, but cooperation is the fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production. Chapter 14 considers in some detail the development of manufacture, the form of cooperation based on the division of labor in some detail. The manufacturing period runs from the mid-16th century to the late 18th century. Marx examines closely the development of the manufacturing labor process out of the handicrafts on which it is based. Note I talked about artisanal production by guilds, by the standard guild form, and you can see that scaling it up changes the way in which you do certain things. You don't have to own your own tools. You know, it's the company's tools, etc. Manufacturer assembles specialized workers in one place and breaks down the process of production into a series of distinct tasks. Thus, it divides up the skills of handicraft production to give a labor force of workers with very narrow specializations on the one hand and unskilled workers on the other. Note this can be inverted by de-skilling workers, that is, which occurs, right? The idea that you become a machine minder rather than someone actively engaged in the production process. This is important and again brings out the sociological character of Marx's approach. For Marx, manufacture is not a technical development that involves the development of methods of production appropriate to different abilities, but is a social development of the labor process under the domination of particular social relations that implies the creation of particular kinds of ability. Unless you think that that's unimportant, the entire education system is designed this way. When I was in grade school or secondary school, tracking was the important deal, where you could divide people up who didn't seem to have quite the same either manual dexterity or cognitive skills and start dividing them up into things to which they were most appropriate. Hence the evolution, ultimately, of the vocational technical school. They were always there. They developed separately, but when you see them integrated into a single, for example, public education system, you can see how that operates. Marx contrasts the division of labor in the workshop, in which the allocation of tasks and the regulation of labor is planned and executed by one will, that of the capitalist, with the division of labor in society, where it is only through the exchange of products as commodities that labor of different forms is brought into contact with one another. The social division of labor, whether it takes the form of the exchange of commodities or the primitive community, etc., is common to many forms of society. The manufacturing form of the technical division of labor is specifically capitalist. Note that the commonly used terms social and technical division of labor do not imply that the technical division of labor is not also a social phenomenon, as I just tried to describe in the educational context. Manufacturing is still based on the skills handed down from the handicraft era, fragmenting and rationalizing the methods of handicraft production. As such, it is limited in the possibilities for increased productivity that it opens up. However, manufacturing not only leads to the extreme specialization of labor, but also to the extreme specialization of tools. And from this develops the machine. Thus, chapter 15 turns to the highly developed form of capitalist production based on the machine. Marx discusses the development of machinery on the basis of the manufacturing division of labor. That is from section 1. With machinery, the cooperative character of labor is integrated into the instrument of labor itself, the machine. This is how the inversion happens. Machinery makes possible the expansion in the employment of women and children. It imposes a further lengthening of the working day. It leads to the intensification of labor, which is the inevitable corollary, the shortening of the working day as capitalists try to pack more labor into the shorter time, so generating renewed pressure for a shorter working day. Note that child labor doesn't get the same wage. It is employed on the same machine that an adult male, let's put it that way, would be used. And you can see that how certain kinds of divisions of labor, and there's a standard image of a child at a loom, at a power loom, to give you that example. Marx then analyzes the development of social relations within the factory. The new form of division of labor that appears, the de-skilling of labor, that's, when you don't have to, this doesn't require a whole bunch of technical skill to operate the machine, whatever. The domination of man by the machine, the separation of mental from manual labor, the rigid discipline. You see, Marx does include mental labor. They just doesn't emphasize it enough for, current purposes. The rigid discipline, the use of the machine as a weapon in the struggle of capital against labor, and the worker's illusion that it is the machine rather than capital that oppresses him. So in a very reactionary way, of course, throw the wooden shoe into the damn machine, sabotage. And a Luddism, as you can see how people go, well, we can still make stuff in the old way, whatever. Then follows a long discussion of the impact of the introduction of machinery on employment. It may throw workers out of work. Although increased accumulation creates more jobs, even when workers can get new employment, their situation becomes unstable. In and out of work, changing occupations, cyclical fluctuations become important. Gig economy. Finally, Marx looks at the wider impact of large-scale industry on society, on manufacture, handicrafts, and domestic industry, which are transformed, where they are not eliminated by competition in response to the escalating industrial demand for their products, so as to present even worse labor conditions in industry itself. There are other things that narrow this that are discussed in terms of 18th century economic history. Marx looks briefly at the impact on education and the family and on agriculture. So we're up to 600 pages now. Chapter 16. This short chapter sums up the discussion of absolute and relative surplus value. Firstly, Marx points out that under the factory system, the product becomes the joint product of a collective laborer rather than an individual product of a collective laborer. Thus, the definition of the productive labor is extended to cover all those who, if not working directly on the product, form part of the collective labor, quote unquote. On the other hand, the definition of the productive labor also becomes more narrow. Since capitalist production is the production of surplus value, only workers who produce surplus value and so contribute, remember about circulating, self-valorization of capital are productive. Marx then returns to the concept of absolute surplus value. The production of absolute surplus value is the extension of the working day beyond the point of necessary labor. You could also add additional shifts. That's the idea of the, second and third shift work. It forms the general foundation of the capitalist system and the starting point for the production of relative surplus value. And you can see how that operates in third shift production. Relative surplus value production involves shortening the necessary labor time by revolutionizing methods of production. Thus, relative surplus value depends on the development of capitalist methods of production and the real subsumption. Remember, we talked about subsumption of labor under capital, Aufhebung, etc., in which the worker is subordinated by the very methods of production. That is a certain idea that the machine transcends the worker, that develops out of the formal subsumption of labor in which capital has taken control of the labor process, but not yet transformed it. While the production of absolute surplus value is characteristic when labor has only formally been subsumed, it continues with the real subsumption and the production of relative surplus value. The transformation of people who learn keyboarding or who learn typing. You can see the difference and the similarity between the two kinds of actions and activities now become even less important because of AI, of first sound to text and then to AI. In some respects, absolute and relative surplus value cannot be distinguished. In all surplus value is both absolute and relative. However, the distinction is meaningful when we consider the need to increase surplus value. The capitalist then has to choose between lengthening the working day or increasing the productivity or intensity of labor. Increasing the intensity of labor in some senses falls between increasing productivity, that is relative surplus value, and lengthening the working day, absolute surplus value, because intensified labor counts as a greater quantity of simple labor. And you can see that reflected in, the issues of wage, right? You got to work extra hours, or we need more shifts, or can you come in early, or can you stay late? Chapter 17, you can skip this chapter. And yet he goes, at great length. This idea is the shifts in living standards of workers, the idea of subsistence, and he describes this at great length, and whether you share or don't share in that productivity, but you can skip it. This brief, chapter 18, this brief note contrasts Marx's formula for the rate of surplus value with that of classical political economy, because the latter had no concept of the value of labor power or of variable capital. This division of, as we remember, right, the difference between constant and variable and fixed and circulating, which are actually kind of important when you actually think about the details. But the classical guys didn't do that, both Smith and Ricardo and etc. This both misrepresents the degree of exploitation of labor, leads to the assumption of a working day of given length. It's an 8-hour day. Well, yeah, but then there are all these people who have other issues, and conceals the specific character of the capital relation instead of giving the impression that capitalists and workers share in the product. Welcome to our corporate family. Chapter 19. This chapter examines the wage form in which the wage and the value of labor power appears in the form of wages for labor, and so makes it appear as though the worker is paid not for his labor power, but for the labor he has performed. Okay, right? So there's a difference between the capacity or capability, the expectation of your ability to do a certain average amount of labor or a maximum, but versus what you're actually doing. Thus, just as with commodity fetishism, we find that appearances are quite different from reality. This form of appearance is fundamental to the ideology of capitalist society, for in it all labor appears as paid labor. And this is the mystification. This is how this is how you get profit. Within the wage form, there are a number of variants. Chapter 20 looks at the variant of time wages, which is especially appropriate for part-time labor and for lengthening the working day through overtime. Chapter 21, you see we're going really fast here, looks at piece wages, which are seen as simply a converted form of time wages. especially appropriate to the capitalist mode of production because of their use to intensify labor. So piecework, piece wages for piece work, which are not necessarily identical, you'll see. And in fact, it's incorporated in the assembly process, or we still do it. That is, pieces are made somewhere in Malaysia, let's say, and they're shipped to Mexico for assembly and then sold in the US. And, you have to ask, well, how much money are they saving doing all this shipping around? Chapter 22 looks at differences in wages between countries. This is important for the discussion of international economic relations. Marx argues that in taking account of the different national wage levels, we have to take account of the social conditions of labor in different countries. They historically develop a level of the workers' needs, the price of the necessities, the extent to which the labor of women and children is used, the length of the working day, the productivity and intensity of labor. Since the productivity and intensity of labor vary from country to country, labor times cannot be directly compared across natural boundaries. Thus, commodities do not have a common international value. G. Correspondingly, people don't, everybody's pretty much, they have average heights and blah, 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 blah. Correspondingly, capitals of countries with high productivity and intensity of labor are able to appropriate super profits through international trade by selling their commodities abroad at prices above the national value in the supplying country, but below that in the buying country. This is England getting cotton or whatever, making stuff, and then selling it back to X country. Finally, high wages should not be equated with a lower level of exploitation, since higher wages correspond to a higher degree of development of the productive forces, and thus a greater intensity of production and productivity of labor. Higher wages have characteristically correspond to a higher rate of exploitation. Now, if that were truly true, you wouldn't be able to get fairly cheap used Rolls Royces, as we've noted from Top Gear. The accumulation of capital, we now begin to move out from the immediate process of production. It is perhaps a good idea at this point to look back over the reading so far, now that you've gotten up to 600 some odd pages. Marx started off by examining the commodity, and the commodity relation is the social relation between commodity owners. He examined money as a developed form of value that emerged out of exchange and introduced the concept of capital, that is, self-expanding value. The self-valorization it expands. It has an expansion capability. Sky's the limit. Not really, but whatever. The concept of capital then took Marx beyond the commodity relation and relations of exchange. And starting from the relation between capitalist and labor as an exchange relation between commodity owners, Marx moved behind this relation to the sphere of production in which the capitalists set the laborer to work. He then analyzed in detail the production of surplus value in the immediate process of production, where the relation between labor and capitalists is no longer a relation of equality between commodity owners, but an exploitative relation in which capital seeks to maximize the surplus value it appropriates. Marx distinguished the labor process from the valorization process and argued that capitalist production is a combination of the two, in which it is valorization that is in command. Recall that we were looking at constant and variable and fixed and circulating. To remember that difference again, this is what's going on. He then went on to examine absolute surplus value and the means of producing absolute surplus value by lengthening the working day. He then turned to relative surplus value and the means of producing this by revolutionizing the means of production, making it more efficient, etc., or more efficient for the machine and less efficient for the worker. This allowed him to examine in great detail the way in which capitalist control of the process of production transformed production as both a social and a technical process in the search for relative surplus value. Finally, Marx had a digression on wages, arguing that wages are the form of appearance of the price of labor power in which it appears that all labor is paid for. The wage bill, as it were. It is thus a form of fetishism, just like the value form in which reality is concealed. This is the mystification process. So far, the analysis of the production of surplus values looks simply at one production period. This will increase what Marx is looking at. Marx needs to look at multiple production periods. That's the whole idea of circulation. However, once surplus value has been produced and incorporated into the original capital, the new and large capital is laid out again, plowing it back in. Thus, capitalist production has a fundamental dynamic, the dynamic of accumulation, in which the scale of capitalist production constantly expands. It is the dynamic of accumulation that governs the development of capitalist society, for it is not simply a quantitative expansion. The increasing scale of accumulation also produces qualitative changes. The concept of capital accumulation is therefore central to Marx's understanding of the historical development of the laws of motion of capitalist society. See, this is where you get that physics comparison. Chapter 23. We move on now. I've done the complete hour, and or not the complete hour. We're actually at 50 minutes of fiddling around like this. So you can see where I want to finish. It's still a bunch here, and I'm not sure we're going to get to the end. I guess we'll finish it tomorrow. We'll finish to the rest of up to chapter 31, where the bonus of describing, as I discussed last week, on the idea of the commons, made however complicated by Brazilians, is important at the large scale form of reproduction level. But I tacked on the end at a Rev Left little presentation on logical critique of capitalism and defending socialism, etc. And you can watch that at your leisure. But we're going to finish with chapter 32. I did a little better than yesterday, I hope. I don't think we can do all of this. I will keep yammering, of course, but I'm not sure whether we can get to the end. So I'll do that tomorrow, and because probably you're all tired, and I lost a couple of people. So let's stop right now, and you can talk. The problem, I can keep yammering on, and this is the disturbing part of what I can do. As I've constantly remembered, I used to have to teach a 4-hour class in one evening, which probably exceeded the work limits on one hand, but it was the only way they could put it in their little schedule, and that is the problem of piecework. Yes, yes, Joe, this is the Capital Cliffs Notes edition. This is the Capital Cliffs Notes edition. And don't call it mystification, call it deception, stealing. Well, yes, that does occur. The machine oppresses me. Well, and the computer oppresses us as well, needless to say. So, all righty. So, Kelly was left as well. So, yeah. Anyway, questions, queries. Brickbat.
How's my sound? Oh, shoot. Dang it. Let me rejoin.
Larry?
Well, I think when I unmute, I'm the echo. So
Okay.
I'll rejoin here just a sec.
I could gaslight you by talking about repeating you. And Kelly's point here was that, yes, and yep, and I keep thinking about how that labor is taken through coercion. No one would choose to spend their time cashiering at Walmart for fun. Yeah, looking at wacky people is just not enough. It's just not enough. A good example, Larry. General Electric motors go in blenders, juicers, mixers. yes, standard engine in a variety of things. And that's not the end of it, how capitalism operates, you know? I mean, the use of time is really important too. There's a whole history of why appliances were created, not only in terms of consumers, but also because of the shifting need for electricity during certain times of the day. If you can get people to use all those appliances during the downtime of the grid, you're going to make more profit ultimately in the long run. I mean, profit for other people as well, and fill the downtimes for utilization. It's not why I work late at night. it really fucks up trying to do actual kind of chores in the day. Yes, time can be a commodity. It is a commodity in that context. Time and space are commodities ultimately as well.
That kind of leads to one of my questions about time and you know, the discussion of various well, of labor and the time spent doing it. I wanted to also say, oh, what about the rest of the day? You know, all the, you know, like the cleaning and stuff like that. That's, you know, I need it to get by, but it's not included in this kind of thing, you know.
Well, you could save it. You could save on it if you got people to clean their own offices or dump your own trash. You know, if you go to work and you eat at your desk, you got to portage out that shit.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm thinking about, you know, like time spent on doing my laundry that is not, you know, related to work, I guess. It's just, you know, me living, subsistence, right?
Yeah, but that's what wives are for, right?
Well, no. I want that to be included in this, you know?
No, there are other ways to do that, right? You could bring your wash to work and whatever if you had a laundry at work at your workplace.
You could, yeah, but either way, you got to do the laundry. You got to spend time doing it. And so you know, as that's some other work that I do. It's not, you know, the work for the capitalist necessarily, but it's work that I do. So I want that, you know, included in any of this calculus or algebra, I guess.
That's quite true. I mean, you could, and probably a good employer would think about that. You know, well, you know, they shouldn't be wearing their own clothes. Let's give them uniforms, and we can have a company laundry.
I gotta say, Larry, I'm not impressed with your problem-solving skills. Why don't you just hire a manservant and a gal Friday?
I mean, you know, why not have untouchables? You know, they scrape up the poop, whatever.
Oh, yeah, they come in handy.
I guess the other thing that I was kind of chafing at was, you know, it's called surplus value. I'd rather call it, you know, stolen value or, you know, something more accurate, you know.
Well, you know, Marx, I think, wanted to be a little bit more euphemistic on the one hand. On the other hand, I think he wanted it to be you know, attractive to middle class radicals. Yeah, didn't have to go all the way.
Hmm.
And as I said, you know, I think if Marx had been you know, this would have been refined better had Marx had an academic appointment rather than working with all those dirty radicals. See, that's my time machine fantasies. Giving Marx a professor's job somewhere.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
I mean, he was working at a disadvantage relative to, you know, Ricardo and Smith. I mean, you know, he's a Werner. I mean, hell.
Didn't Adam Smith live it with his mom? I thought I heard that recently.
He got a little farther with his publishing. And he lived a little earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a really good question or a question at all, but I always wondered where or why economists had so much their obsession with efficiencies and the basically robbing of time away from people. I if you travel to different countries, time appears to run at a different pace. It could be more
The Italian, the Mediterranean time.
yeah,
The
you
siesta
know,
time and
it's
going into
it
the
could
evening. Yeah.
it could be frenetic or a snail's pace. And here in Norway, I find I default to my native pace, but dealing with the Norwegian pace, I can feel my
You're not
impatience.
you're not being efficient enough.
Wait,
But that's the
no,
difference between
It's much slower than the States,
oh, that's not.
very much slower, but it's highly efficient. So I don't really have a question. I just
no, those are the
always time and efficiency are always like a focus, and people don't feel they have enough time in the day, and it's just about relaxing, slowing down, and not I don't know, you just can relax and move on. Things get done. I mean, the economists are always trying to work out these inefficiencies. They talk about whole economies or whole nations being inefficient or not as productive.
well, that's what
This seems like a warped way of looking at human life and meaning and value of human life and time spent
that's
on the planet.
that's the problem of a mixed economy, right? Where you some things are socialized, other things aren't. And you can see that even happening within the context of state capitalism. That like you could some people have referred to the Soviet Union as state capitalism, as a kind of it's not full communism, it's not even full socialism. You still have production quotas to meet because we got to kill more Nazis, and that kind of work got moved across the Urals in the middle of World War II, so that people were slaving at very minimal kind of they were it's pure efficiency. We've got to make more tanks to beat Russians. I mean, beat Nazis, whatever. So in a mixed economy, you can have a combination of these things. Some people have just different lengths of thresholds of pain or thresholds of tolerance, whatever. And it is amazing how Italian and Spanish economies they're sort of okay. I mean, they still make shit. Italians actually, they have usually pretty efficient relative to price stuff, with all the usual provisos, right? Fiats, or if you've ever owned I haven't, an Alfa Romeo or something, or Maserati, and they never work.
Oh yeah, that reminds me of that bit about how workers in different countries. He was sort of saying, well, you can't do this like generalized worker because of these differences between in countries.
Well, it's part of it, but mainly it's about work relations. People in Southeast Asia work longer days generally, and they work more days a week. They only have maybe even only 1 day a week off, etc.
Okay, yeah. So that leads to, like, the work week or whatever, the limit of that, right?
Right.
And it's just a big
And
limit.
there's no a limit on child labor. I'm not saying that it's scads of child labor, but I would wager that certain types of industries do have a lot of teenagers working in their on their.
Yeah, it seems like you could derive some kind of general and then, compare the different countries to it to get a gauge on how, far back they are, or how exploited they are.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you could. Some people would not want to, provide that data, of course, because then people would realize they're being exploited.
Well, yeah, that's what we need to do, man.
Well, I think I've yammered far too much, and maybe we can cut the recording. Let me thank you for your attention. I will post the link, and thank you for your attention. And so we can